about the foresight and the vision of the folks who put the interstate system in place. Can you imagine what it would be like to take a trip, across the country?
99% of the people probably take it for granted. It's there and we're not interested how it got there.
How close are you to an interstate system? How close are you to a 4-lane divided road? I mean, those are important things.
It's the greatest public works project in the world, the interstate system in the United States.
While the concept of the superhighway was first introduced to a mass American audience at the 1939 World's Fair, Futurama didn't automatically materialize across the nation. That same year, a transcontinental highway network was described in a report to Congress, but it would go through many changes on the road to realization. It weathered years of legislative wrangling and wartime delays until the former general and then President Dwight D. Eisenhower finally brought about decisive action.
I was in World War II in the Navy, so we knew who Eisenhower was very well. And then when he took over as president after the war, we listened to him.
You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
We had several federal aid bills. Then we had the famous one in 1956 that actually was signed by then President Eisenhower and was the beginning of the interstate system as we know it now.
They worked up a funding mechanism whereby 90% of the cost would be paid by the federal government. After World War II, after 1945, with the economy being rebuilt, traffic really did start booming, auto traffic as well as truck traffic.
We originally set out the 20-year project to complete the system, and the objective was really trying to do it in much less time than that. It was a large undertaking for the states because they did not have the type of disciplines of all of the different areas and utilities and right-of-way and so forth to handle a large development, the interstate system. And that's where Federal Highway Administration was an integral part. And I was a part of that from the beginning of the interstate system. I was with the Federal Highway Administration. And we assisted the states in building their departments. It was a very interesting time, and we were busy.
You have to think we have just come out of a war. We have come out with a can-do attitude. You do have, to some extent, almost a quasi-military organization in many of the state highway departments and many of the contracting firms. You had draftsmen, you had people out in the field, you had people who were doing calculations, no computers, no CAD. Many offices barely had typewriters.
The interstate system wasn't exactly built from scratch. Before it began to take shape, turnpikes and other limited access highways were already springing up around the country. The Pennsylvania Turnpike, heralded as the model for interstate highway standards, opened its first section in 1940. By 1952, Northern Virginia could claim the state's first controlled access road, the 17-mile Shirley Highway, from Woodbridge to the Potomac at Washington, D.C., now I-395. Soon, Central Virginia would have its own, the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, which ran from US 301 in Henrico to Route 1 in Dinwiddie.
Even in short segments, various examples of these highways were being built. So it maybe wasn't such as a sharp dividing line as some people might think. It was more of an evolution than a revolution, seeing gradually better and better highways being built. The Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike Authority was created in 1955. They funded the road with 100% toll revenue bonds, completed in 1958, 34 miles with tolls, built basically interstate standards or close to interstate standards. Before the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, you had Route 1, which was basically the 4-lane undivided highway that you see in many places now. It had gotten very congested soon after World War II, very slow trip. And to have a superhighway bypass all that was a huge improvement.
Pre-interstates, we depended much on the primary system between the states. And from one state to another, it varied tremendously.
The whole concept of uniformity of roads, of standards, is really a pretty radical concept. It was completely new to what people were used to and what they were expecting. And in many cases, of course, even signage that we take for granted were things that were not fully comprehensible to a lot of folks.
In 1958, I was 7 years old, and I remember distinctly that afternoon that the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike opened, and my mother and daddy wanted to get the family in the car and just take a ride and see what it was all like. This was an adventure. We got in a 1955 Ford station wagon. We took a ride down the turnpike. I'm not quite sure how far he went, but I do know that it was kind of a confusing experience. It was something that was completely different than anything we'd ever done before. To get on the turnpike and go at faster speeds was just totally different. And then the posted speed limit was 60 miles an hour, and that seemed really, really fast.
But it wasn't exactly the promised magic carpet ride at first. There was a toll-free test drive opportunity on opening day, June 30th, 1958, and 50,000 motorists snarled every lane for the entire length of the highway.
One of the interesting things I seem to remember was that we had one person coming the wrong way on one of the exit ramps, all because everybody was learning something new. Merging on a highway was a new thing.
You're dealing with directions that have no precedent, that are completely foreign to what people are used to. It's a steep learning curve and really a bit of a shock. You are starting to see this change happening at the time, and things just accelerate tremendously from the standpoint of technology, of what a car can do, and of what people expect that they can do.
Before it was even complete, the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike joined more than 2,000 miles of toll roads that were incorporated into the interstate system. While it became part of I-95, Congress didn't authorize the purchase of the turnpike, so tolls would be collected for decades to retire the revenue bonds on the initial $75 million project, including future improvements and 5 other local road initiatives. The price of implementing the rest of the interstate system proved as fluid as determining the exact paths it would take. The original figure of between $25 and $27 billion quickly escalated as alterations to the standard 4-lane model proved necessary in many areas.
There had to be some reworking of some of the standards that were set initially, particularly in the urban areas. And that started bringing the cost up, where it turned out that it cost nearly $126 billion, all with highway user funds, no other tax dollars involved. That entails the gas tax primarily, all automobile parts, and automobile taxes. So everything has to do with the parts of an automobile and running that automobile is where that money came from.
Just as mathematical reason guided the funding, the numeric designation of the routes themselves followed a prescribed formula. Generally speaking, the odd-numbered interstates run north-south, while the even ones run east to west. The plan was to link 90% of American cities with populations of 50,000 or more. To accomplish that feat across our land, highway planners took to the sky.
When the interstate system came along, then we started flying and mapping areas of the state where we think it would go. 95 was pretty well identified of needing the north-south route, and we had the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike that was doing exactly what we wanted to do with the interstate. But the aerial photogrammetry was necessary. You flew the areas, and then we'd get to the drawing board and start putting some lines, avoiding major problems that you wanted to avoid, and historic areas and so forth. And then you get some lines that you then could get out and really see what the terrain was. And then you go to public hearing with those lines.
The meeting will come to order.
So the public has a chance to have some input. You had to develop 3 alternatives. For every route, had 3 alternatives. When those lines were refined and you had your public hearings, and then you start tying down what you're going to build.
There was a lot riding on those decisions. I-64's pathway was no different. Most interstates followed existing state routes, as 64 did from Hampton Roads to Henrico, but the course onward from Varina was very much in debate. Would it continue to parallel Route 60, heading south of the James toward Lynchburg? Or would it track US 250 through western Henrico and on to Charlottesville and Afton Mountain?
When you were looking at routes in Virginia, we needed to have, through the center of the state, we needed to have a east-west mobility.
I came with the county in March of '59, and I came in with the title of planner, but the county manager really wanted an administrative assistant. So I did as much supervising the planning office as working with him on a daily basis. And I had been working in Blacksburg trying to convince the state to move 81 closer to Blacksburg than Christiansburg. I didn't win that battle. It went closer to Christiansburg. But I came to Henrico. Lo and behold, we're in sort of the same situation. 64 has been built to Laburnum, where White Oak is now, and they were trying to make a decision: do we swing south and go through Chesterfield, or north and go through Henrico? I asked the county manager, and he said, we really don't care. If it goes through western Henrico, it's going to block all our streets. And I said, no, Mr. Beck, it won't. They will give us overpasses, underpasses, or interchanges at major roads like Parham, and he left it to me. I felt so strongly about what needed to be done.
He was pushing for Henrico as a planner, and those people were extremely important in this whole process, and he did a great job. The majority of people were supportive of the present route. It was going to serve more people. It would interconnect with more primary roads.
And so we did get the western route through Henrico. If we hadn't have, western Henrico would have never been anything like it is today. And of course, this didn't take place overnight. It moved from Laburnum and gradually on through the city into the county.
With cannons, flyovers, bands, balloons, and a bevy of pageant winners, including Miss Highway herself, it was the talk of the town when a section of the interstate opened.
The ribbon cutting ceremonies for our roadways, they're all upbeat, and our public relations people try to bring in locals and get their input, and I encourage that. We try to make it a joyous occasion, and we're always proud. It was a time that you really wanted the locals that were supporting this whole endeavor and so forth, a chance for them to be seen. And a lot of just curious people show up there, that's for sure. It's a big deal.
And I-64 was a big deal for Henrico County. Not only did it provide a critical link to the airport, the coast, and the Blue Ridge, it laid the foundation for Henrico's future growth.
I think that the growth and prosperity that Henrico County has enjoyed for well over the last half century is in significant part due to the location of I-64. The way I liken I-64, I-64 is like a spine through Henrico County. And Henrico was able to take advantage of that spine, unlike virtually any other county in the Commonwealth of Virginia, by building what I call the ribs along I-64. And the spine together with the ribs, in essence, created nodes that you would create commercial development, and then further along the ribs you had the residential development. And so that has been a key to the stability of Henrico County financially, a realist of over 50 years. You've had this mix that few counties have and few localities have of commercial and residential.
In terms of the interstate system, obviously two major issues that are the drivers for business decisions are access to markets and access to labor. And if you stop and think about it, without the interstate systems, we wouldn't be able to promote Henrico like we do. We're very well positioned in the middle of the Atlantic Seaboard. We are within basically a one-day delivery time for products and services for about 2/3 of the country's population. And so we have a very strategic location, but without the interstate system, it wouldn't be so strategic. The other piece of it, and probably the number one factor for attracting business today, is the ability to attract the right kind of labor. Labor markets are regional in nature. We enjoy in this region about a 22-minute commute time on average. Without the interstate system, we wouldn't be able to do that.
The final component of the original 1956 plan for Central Virginia, I-295, faced uncertainty and major alterations of its own years after its adjoining routes had gone into service.
The first priority was getting 95 and 64 completed in the Richmond-Petersburg area. And then 295, the bypass, would come later. And when they actually did the planning studies, it was basically its current route coming down to Chester, coming across the river between the Varina area and Chester. And there was a lot of opposition by the U.S. Department of Interior to crossing battlefield lands. Some of them were not official, but there were trenches and embankments from the Civil War in that area. And they basically said, no, you can't do that. And that's where the concept came from, to extend I-295 from the Varina area straight down to south of Petersburg. And that, I think it was 1977 or 78 that was approved. I think first construction was in 77, and the entire northern loop was completed by 1981, which is I-64 short pump north of the city down to Route 60 near Sandston. And at that point, they had actual final design studies for the whole eastern part of 295, and that construction ran, I believe, from 1984, segment by segment, till 1992.
The final section opened in June of that year, closing the gap on the roughly 52-mile-long bypass of the Richmond and Petersburg metro areas. That same month, the final toll was paid on the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike. What is now known as the Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways was basically complete by 1996, although some sections have been scrapped while others were added as needs evolved. As many as 80,000 vehicles per day pass through Henrico on I-295, while about 75,000 use some portion of 64 in the county. I-95 averages more than 100,000 vehicles a day between the city line and Brook Road. True to the vision of the early planners, these highways united the far corners of the nation, changing lives and landscapes as they went.
The impact of this roadway is fantastic. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do.
Not only can you get places with convenience and speed that you never had before, they can take you places that you've never been. They can enable you to have much more mobility than you ever had. You don't necessarily have to stay right where you were born and raised, or your other, of course, alternative in this country and elsewhere, if you left, you were probably going to leave forever and you might never get back. Now you can come home for Thanksgiving because you've cut improved roads and the interstate.
Growing up, I would go back to Colorado to visit family about every summer, and I remember what the trip was like before interstates, and I remember what the trip was like after interstates, and it was vastly different. And it was amazing to see the interstate system in the early days.
It definitely has changed people's lives. It was a real win-win type situation, and proving it today.